Hello and welcome back, goats, to the BigBluePurple channel. In this video, I am happy to inform you all that I've finally cleared the Savage tier in Party Finder. In this video, I want to talk about what it was like to PF the tier, specifically P11 and P12, because I've already made a video on my channel about P9 and P10, which I will leave a link to on the screen or in the description or something if you want to go check that out first. At the end of this video, I also want to talk about how my thoughts have kind of changed on P9 and P10 throughout reclears, so if you kind of want to hear how my thoughts have evolved on that, then stay tuned. Anyways, let's just kind of start where we left off with the previous video. After I cleared P10, remember this was like the very beginning of week 2 is when I cleared P10. I was actually just really burnt out after that. I hated PFing P10 as much as I do love that fight and think it's amazing. I hated the experience of trying to clear it in Party Finder, and it really burnt me out. So I ended up taking like a week off of raiding as a whole. I didn't even do reclears that week. And this is when I ended up farming the Gwibs and making that video as kind of like a side project to just do something else. So if you're wondering why there was such a huge gap in time between when I cleared P10 and then when I cleared P11 and 12, it's just because I was really burnt out and couldn't really bring myself to join parties. This is also part of the reason I ended up switching back to Reaper, even though I had intended to play Dark Knight this tier. I found tanking with random people in PF to just be extremely frustrating at times. The co-tanks always wanted to do something different, there was never any kind of consistency, and I honestly just hated adjusting for it, so I decided, you know what, I'll just go back to playing melee DPS, I don't have to do any thinking, and I'll have a lot more fun. And the second major reason I went back to Reaper was I planned to do top and DSR with Reaper anyway, because it's my main job. So I figured getting better at the job with this tier was a good opportunity for me. So after I took a bit of a break and I made the switch back to Reaper, I decided to go into P11. P11 was a weird fight coming off of P10 because it was just so much easier to prog, to learn, to clear. P11 only took me 2 days to prog and clear in its entirety, and that was in Party Finder with just random people. It was a nice breather after the hell that was P10, and the music in this fight also just kind of helps to make for a very relaxing experience while you're in it. That being said, I think this is easily the worst fight of the entire tier. It's really boring once you've done it a few times, and he kind of just spams the same mechanics a zillion times, and that's it. The three things he does over and over again are divisive, jury, and upheld overruling. And then he also combines either light or dark elements with these attacks, which kind of changes how you resolve them. If it's a light, you need to end it with a light party stack, and if it's dark, you need to end it with a partner stack. Once you get comfortable with these three mechanics, you've effectively learned everything there is to learn. Obviously, there's still dark and light, which is the wall for most people, and then letter of the law as well. But both of those mechanics are just the three mechanics I just talked about combined with another little gimmick. You know, you have mechanics like Lightstream and Shadowed Messengers in the fight, which, like, should feel different, but because they just end in the same, like, line dashes and light party stacks and partner stacks, everything in this fight just feels exactly the same to resolve. Like, every single mechanic just feels exactly the same to resolve. This is fine when you're progging because it's like, it makes for a very fast-paced learning experience. You feel like you're catching on to things really quick and you're like, oh, this is awesome, like, I'm getting really good at this fight. When in reality, it's just like, yeah, I mean, he's doing the same thing the whole time. Of course you're getting pretty good at it by now. The overrulings in this fight suffer from the same issue I accused P9 of with its dual spells. I said that the dual spells in P9 were used way too much, which I still think is partially true, but at the same time, when looking at this fight in comparison, it makes dual spell look like it's used sparingly and tastefully. Dark and Light is effectively this fight's wall mechanic, but in comparison to the walls in the previous fights, I mean, look at LC1 in P9, or Harrowing Hell in P10, those are much bigger walls to overcome in my opinion than Dark and Light is. Dark and Light, like, after you look at the toolbox a couple times, like, you just kind of know what you need to do, and once you rep it enough times, like, it's a lot easier, in my opinion, than the Limit Cut was to learn, or even Harrowing Hell. It made for kind of an interesting prog experience with this fight, because as you're going through it, you never really feel hard stuck on anything or like super confused by anything. You just kind of keep making prog with every party, and I think that's why I had a pretty easy time clearing this fight. Like I said, it only took 2 days, And within the first day, I had seen Dark and Light and practiced it a bit, and then by the second day, I was just joining clear parties, and I finished the fight in a few parties. Also, Dark Current, the mechanic after the Dark and Light tethers, is just so out of place and weird in this fight. It feels like an extreme trial mechanic, or even like a normal mode mechanic for how easy it is to resolve, and it doesn't even feel like it fits the theming of what this fight is going for. So every time I did the mechanic, I just found myself asking, like, why is this here? What does this add? It feels like there should have been another, like, major wall mechanic right placed where Dark Current is. Letter of the Law is the final major mechanic, and this one's kind of a wall because the problem with it, like a lot of things in this tier, and we'll get to that with P12, is that it just serves as a body check. If one person dies to, like, the beginning of Letter of the Law, like the first initial hits, then it's gonna be a wipe because someone couldn't soak a tower, and that means you're all dead. The mechanic itself isn't super hard to execute, and it's just testing you on all the things you already learned throughout the fight. It's not as much of a new mechanic as it is combining two old mechanics. It's pretty fun to execute, and I think it's one of the more exciting parts of this fight, but it still just leaves me wondering, like, this fight feels like it's missing something. It just feels like it's missing that extra mechanic that would add some level of difficulty to the fight. Obviously, it's still a Savage encounter and it doesn't just fall over and die, but it was still kind of jarring coming from P10, where that fight was so much harder than this, and it asked so much more from the players in terms of mitigation, in terms of healing. And it's not to say this fight is easy on mit and heals. It's pretty harsh. Like, the outgoing damage is pretty high, but there's no, like, harrowing hell moment. There's nothing that just, like, that really makes you focus up and get nervous in this fight. It's very much just going through the motions over and over again until the boss falls over. I think if this fight was swapped with P10 and, like, where it's placed in the tier, like if this was the second fight, it would make way more sense, and I think I'd be a lot less harsh on this fight. But at the same time, if I went from P9 spamming dual spell to this fight spamming the overrulings, I would be wondering what the fuck they're doing with these fights, because it feels like it's just one mechanic over and over again. For the actual PF experience of this fight, though, like how I felt PFing it, it's kind of hard to break that down because of how fast this fight died. Like I said, the first day was me just progging up to Dark and Light and then practicing that a bit. And then the second day, I just kind of skipped to clear parties. Like, I had watched some POVs, got an idea for what the rest of the fight looked like, and I just started joining clear parties until I cleared it. And that was it. I don't recommend you to skip prog points like I did if you're not confident in yourself, but if you are, it can make Party Finder rating a lot more tolerable. I did have to live with the pain of seeing a 0.1% in rage on this fight twice, because the group I had just had like 5 or 6 deaths every time we got to the enrage, and it was just a complete mess, until we finally got that clean pull, of course, and we killed it with that group. And it's not like the enrage is super tight on this fight or anything like that. It was literally just like 6 deaths in a run, of course you're going to see it. Or like 5 deaths and a heal LB. Like, you're seeing enrage, you know? All in all, P11 was really chill to prog. It helped ease me back into raiding after P10 really burnt me out, and I do not blame the fight for burning me out at all. It was the groups, it was the people, it was PF that burnt me out, and I think with P11 I just got pretty lucky with groups, had a really chill experience, and it eased me back into Party Finder. Of course, I had no clue how bad it was about to get when I stepped into P12. P12S was an absolute roller coaster of a fight, if I had to describe it. It was somehow the most enjoyable prog experience I've ever had, while simultaneously being the least fun I've ever had joining clear parties in the Party Finder. Let's start with the experience of actually progging the fight in PF, because that was the most fun I had with this tier in general, progging Phase 1. Every single mechanic that this fight throws at you requires you to take it seriously, focus on it, and do it correctly. It's not like P11 where it just does the same thing a million times, and it's not like P10 where it has difficulty spikes at certain parts of the fight. It is a consistently difficult and challenging and engaging fight the whole way through. Of course, the very first mechanic, Paradigma 1, is essentially fully skipped by just having your tanks press invul, so yeah, that's sick. Other than Para 1 though, every mechanic in this fight is its own kind of wall in a sense. Party Finder struggles with all of these mechanics, which becomes a source of just absolute rage when you're trying to clear Phase 1. But while you're progging it and you still have patience left, it's honestly really fun, and the fight's super satisfying to do correctly. Para 2 is a pretty straightforward mechanic. The tethered players just stretch opposite of their ad, and the tower players just follow a very basic prio system to know where to stand. DPS players always look northwest, and they rotate counterclockwise, and supports look northeast, and then just rotate clockwise until they find a buddy of the opposite color. Basically, you need to find someone who is tethered to the opposite color of your tower. So if you're a light tower, you find a dark tether. If you're a dark tether, you find a light tower, etc. After Para 2, we reach what I would say is one of the best mechanics of this entire tier, with Super Chain Theory 1. There's a lot of movement going on here. You have to do your 2 minute in the middle of it. You need to pay attention to your debuffs and decide what you need to do because of that. And there's just so much thinking and like fast-paced movement going on. I love this mechanic. I never got bored of executing it, and I love trying to optimize the little things each time I did it. This mechanic is the culmination of everything you've learned from the tier so far. Can you do partner stacks and spreads all while reading your debuffs and doing a fast-paced movement at the same time, all under your 2 minute burst? Because if you can, then that's great. You can do Super Chain, and it's just a super satisfying mechanic to execute. I loved learning it, I loved progging it, and I loved executing it every single goddamn pull. Also, I haven't really talked about her like wing cleaves that she does, because honestly, they're really easy to dodge. The one thing I will say about them, though, that's super annoying is the snapshot happens like 30 years early. Like, if you were standing in the AoE like 25 seconds before it goes off, you still just get hit for some reason, and it's absurd. The snapshotting in this fight is some of the most like absurd, just bullshit I've ever seen in this game. Obviously, you just adjust to it and you make sure you pre-position to not get hit, but it looks so ridiculous when your character has been in the safe spot for 10 seconds and you just eat a damage down anyway. Para 3 is the next mechanic, and this one's super cool. It's similar to Para 2, where you need to use the towers and the laser beams and stuff, but the platforms disappear so that only 4 remain, and then the healers and the DPS both need to do different things to make sure the mechanic is resolved properly. DPS will either always be soaking towers or baiting ads, depending on the color of their tether, and the supports always have to deal with these cross AoEs they drop on the floor, and they actually have to drop the towers for the DPS players. I really like how this mechanic like splits the responsibility between the two roles, and it changes how the mechanic feels depending on what role you're playing as. I'm looking forward to coming back in here as tank and learning how Para 3 works as a tank, since I've never done that before. Para 3 is much easier to do than Super Chain. The biggest difficulty of it is not getting clipped by someone's laser by accident, but once you figure out where to stand, you just stand there every time and you are chillin'. Honestly, progging up to this point was really smooth. Para 3 didn't take long to learn. Super Chain was a bit of a wall, but once you got through it, you got through it. Limit cut here is where shit got rough, and honestly, it's not because this limit cut is that hard, it's just that if one guy fucks up, you're all dead. Which again is a common trend for mechanics this tier. I actually personally found this limit cut easier to learn than the one in P9, interestingly enough, but I think that comes down to the fact that this limit cut is essentially exactly like Wormhole if Wormhole was made a lot simpler. 2 numbers are always paired together, you always bait your 2 jumps together, and then you bait lasers in the order of 5-7, 6-8, 1-3, 2-4. It's one of those things that sounds and looks incredibly confusing before you've done it, but when you get there you're like, oh, this actually really isn't that bad at all. At least that was my experience with it, and I do think doing T prior to this fight helped a lot with learning that limit cut, because like I said, it's quite similar to Wormhole and how you execute it. Unfortunately, what I learned from clear parties on this fight is that people are terrible at limit cut in Party Finder. 90% of the time you wipe on this fight in clear parties or in Phase 2 prog parties when you're wiping to Phase 1, the reason you wipe is like limit cut 90% of the time. It makes it so you're just holding your fucking breath every time you get there, like thinking who's gonna fuck up this time, who's gonna fuck up this time. And when it goes cleanly, it's just such a relief. It doesn't help that the raid wide that immediately follows this mechanic is a body check because it's split damage for the entire party. If you have more than 2 people dead, it's 100% going to be a wipe, especially if your barrier healer is one of those dead people. The next mechanic, Super Chain 2, is where Party Finder just completely falls apart. I had so much fun progging everything up to Super Chain 2, but this is where everything just became a complete disaster. First of all, to actually practice it, you need to pass Limit Cut, which is already an impossible task for Party Finder in like half of the parties you join. And secondly, this is the final major mechanic of the fight, meaning that many people who join clear parties just pretend they've seen it before and just kind of watch a guide and assume they'll be okay. The problem with that is that Super Chain 2 is not any kind of pushover of mechanic. In fact, it's probably the second hardest mechanic in the fight next to Super Chain 1. It's not because it's super hard to fundamentally understand what you need to do, and I think that's why so many people think they can do it. It's the execution where it actually becomes difficult, because the movement is super fast, and at the same time you're doing the movement, you need to know which way to dodge for the wings, and which way you're going to dodge either the spreads or the partner stacks. You could start in the south and then go back to the south, or you could start in the south and run all the way north. You could start north, run all the way south. All at the same time, her wings are going left, right, left, or left, left, right. And you have to memorize all of those things all at once right before the mechanic goes in. It's also immediately followed by a stack body check, so that's awesome. If you lose more than like 3 people to Super Chain 2A, then that's it. That's the run. GG's. Super Chain 2B is then the victory lap afterwards. It's much easier than 2A, because it's not a super quick movement. The movement's actually really slow. You need to do a couple spreads or partner stacks and dodge some ads and stuff, but it's honestly a pretty easy movement, and once you've done it like twice, you just have it down forever. As long as you can do this Super Chains somewhat cleanly at the end of this fight, you will be able to kill the door boss, but Party Finder could not do this to save their fucking lives when I was trying to clear Phase 1. It took me 4 days of joining clear parties non-stop. Phase 1 clear parties just every fucking day, several hours a day trying to get the clear, and none of them could do it for 4 fucking days. Also, this was my first ever door boss. I didn't do P8S, I skipped it, and I went and did T and Uwu instead, because I was just more interested in those fights at the time. So this was my first experience with having to deal with a door boss every time you need to prog a true boss, and I had no fucking idea how annoying it was going to be to get back to Phase 2 with Phase 2 prog parties. Something you learn very quickly in the 12th Circle is that the P1 memes never end. Phase 2 of P12 is where the fatigue really started to set in. I spent so much time trying to do P1 in Rage, and when I finally got to P2, it was a breath of relief, but it was also just a dread that I knew every party had to kill the door boss again to practice this next boss, and I had to prog an entire other fight before I was finally done with this tier. I think I would have had a significantly less fatiguing and annoying prog experience if these were 2 separate encounters that each had a few more mechanics to make them both like 10-minute long fights. I think I would have way more fun progging this second phase if it was just its own thing I could have queued into that had maybe a couple more extra mechanics to make it more difficult as a result of not being a true boss locked behind a door boss. You can really feel with the mechanics in this second phase that they're not a joke or super easy or anything, but they're more about solving a puzzle than they are about doing like a tight movement like the super chain theories were. There is no super chain theory in Phase 2. There is no mechanic with the super fast, tight movement you need to make. Everything is a slow, intricate puzzle with only one correct solution. This UAV mechanic, as it's called by the community, in reference to the top memes back when the world's first team was caught cheating, this mechanic is weird. It looks really cool from a spectator's point of view, I would imagine. It looks like there's some crazy shit going on here. But when you're actually the one playing it, it's extremely simple and like feels like filler. This whole top-down view and this like entire idea of this mechanic just feels like wasted potential. It's such a cool idea, but it only shows up twice in the fight, and the second time it shows up, they don't do anything new with it really. They just incorporate partner stacks in at the end, which is something we've done a zillion times this tier anyway. That being said, the classical concepts, the next mechanic, is a much more interesting idea and a pretty fun puzzle to get the hang of while you're learning it. Basically, there's going to be these 4 blue hexagons that spawn. Everyone gets PlayStation symbols, and they need to block the blue hexagon from being touched by the other colored shapes. This is resolved very easily by assigning a BPOG lineup. This means blue, purple, orange, green from west to east. So you have a priority on who goes to what hexagon, and then you just simply block the side that the other person isn't blocking. Beta debuff gets the squares, and alpha debuff gets the triangles. Interestingly enough, this is just a rule that PF uses. It's not how the mechanic needs to be resolved. Any debuff can actually soak any shape, which is kind of interesting. It makes you wonder what those debuffs are even for, but it definitely gives more clarity, when you're in the Party Finder. UAV 1 and Classical 1 are basically the warm-up mechanics as it works its way up to Caloric 1, which is, in my opinion, the first massive wall of this fight. This mechanic is also just my favorite in Phase 2 by a long shot. I think it is so fucking interesting and cool. Basically, players are going to get fire stacks, which need to be soaked as partners, and wind, which is going to be a spread. You need to get away from everyone. The catch here is that you have stacks of caloric, and if you get 5 stacks of caloric, you blow up and you die. How do you get stacks of caloric? By either soaking fire or by moving. This makes it so your movement is completely limited during this mechanic, so the people with the wind who need to spread away from the group, they have a super limited amount of moves they can make, almost like you're a pawn on a chessboard, and you can only move so much within this grid that the arena becomes. It's such an interesting mechanic and such a cool concept. I absolutely love this one, and I had so much fun learning it. The next mechanic is probably the worst mechanic in this fight. It's just like these exaflares into spreads. It looks like there's stuff happening, but it's a whole lot of nothing when you're the one actually executing it. It feels so easy to do, like it's just a filler mechanic. This leads into probably my second favorite mechanic of the fight though, with Pangenesis. This mechanic is super cool, and it's actually really interesting because a lot of the difficulty of Pangenesis comes from the very beginning of it on figuring out where the fuck you're going. As soon as you know what you're doing, this mechanic resolves itself effectively. But understanding what each of the debuff has to do, getting comfortable with each of the debuffs and being each of them at least once, and just getting the movement down for this mechanic feels incredibly satisfying. I would say this, along with Caloric 1, are the two major walls because it's just the biggest knowledge barrier to overcome in the fight. You need to understand what each debuff is, what it does, and where to go with it. But once you got that down, man, this mechanic is super satisfying to execute, and I think it's a really, really cool idea. After Pangenesis, the fight calms down a lot, and I feel like it's mostly just winding down towards its conclusion. Classical 2 is technically harder than Classical 1 because you need to mirror your position from where it is. She basically flips all the shapes 180 degrees, and you have to know how to adjust to that. But it's made very simple by just pulling up this cheat sheet I'll put on the screen now. If you look at this, you just have this open on your phone while you're doing the mechanic. You don't have to do any thinking. You just are like, okay, I'm this, so I go here. And then the mechanic is done, you've resolved it. The protean that you have to bait actually comes out much sooner during Classical 2. It comes out before the shapes explode. So the way you bait your protean is a lot more important in Classical 2, and you have to be more mindful of how you do it. After this, with a competent group, the fight is effectively over. You still have Caloric 2, but Caloric 2 is really easy if you know what you're doing. The problem is, people in Party Finder don't know what they're doing, and when they join a clear party, they actually are just progging Caloric 2 and they don't know how to fucking do it, so you die to it over and over and over again for no good reason, because no one understands how to do Caloric 2. Yeah, this is where my impatience and my salt with the tier and just the parties really came, to the front and center of everything. It didn't help that I just saw some of the craziest shit I've ever seen in Party Finder this tier. I had a Phase 2 party where the Red Mage did not attack the boss for the entirety of the hour we spent in the instance. My friend and I went back and looked at all the pull logs from that group. The Red Mage didn't cast a single offensive spell. They were just doing mechanics and not pressing buttons for who knows what reason. This sounds like something I'm making up because they had to hit the door boss to kill it, and they did hit the door boss. They were casting spells on the door boss. As soon as we got to the second phase, they're just no rotation, only mechanics. They didn't say a word about it. They didn't warn us that they were doing that. They just started doing that. If that's not griefing, I don't know what is. Anyway, sorry, I've seen a lot. I need to vent a bit, okay? Party Finder is a fucking menace. Caloric 2 is literally just hot potato. You walk in a circle passing around this debuff, and once you pass the debuff to the next person, you spread out to little lines on the floor, like there's a little grid showing you exactly where you need to be, telling you, please stand on me, please stand on this grid, and if you do that right, then you've done the entire mechanic and that's it. It is as easy as it looks, but people can't do it for some reason. Finally, the last mechanic is just another one of those UAV, like, tiny mode mechanics. Also, I didn't mention it at the beginning, but when you're, like, in this part of the fight, like, this UAV mechanic, you move extremely slow because your character's, like, really small. It's like you're walking through fucking sludge. So popping sprint here is, like, a must. Without sprint, it feels terrible to navigate this, like, mechanic. When it comes to the actual Party Finder experience of this fight, it was pretty miserable the whole way through. I had to set up a clear for one to even get my clear, because I was putting up clear parties for like 5 days in a row. I think it was actually an entire week in a row. I was putting up clear parties for Phase 2, and like actually 50% of them or more couldn't do Phase 1. It was brutal. And then the ones that did make it to Phase 2 just immediately blew up on Caloric 2 for like no noticeable reason. It was like people would die to damage because there was no MIT, and then fucking you'd just blow up because someone died. Or people would move too much when they're spreading out because they can't look at the fucking lines on their floor because their monitor's not powered on. It's brutal, I tell you, and it pushed me harder than any Ultimate even pushed me in terms of patience. I think the difference was I loved the Ultimate fights, and so I never really got sick of them. By the time I cleared P12, I was so fucking bored of these mechanics, and I was so just ready to move on with my life and stop joining parties. That being said, I don't hate P12. I think Phase 2 is kind of meh outside of Pangenesis and Caloric 1. But I still think it's cool. It has cool ideas. It really makes you feel like you're just like really tiny in comparison to this boss. Like no other fight really makes you feel. It's cool. It's really cool. I think Caloric 1 and Pangenesis are like the two prog points of this fight that you really hit. After Classical 2, I just started joining clear parties personally. I don't recommend that people do that if they are slow learners or they don't like learn very well from POVs. For me personally, I learned very well from just looking at POVs and toolboxes. I was incredibly confident with just skipping that prog point and doing it right. But please, for the love of God, do not lie about prog. Do not do what I do if you are not confident in yourself. So all in all, if I had to give a verdict on P12 Phase 2, I would say it's not as good as Phase 1 at all. I think Phase 1 is like probably the best fight of the whole tier. Phase 2 is not even as good as P10 in my opinion. I think P10 is actually way better than this fight. But it's still cool, and it's better than P9 and P11 by a long shot. It's without a doubt the third most interesting fight. It's just like, there's a lot of wasted potential here, like I said. You know, UAV 2, it feels like they just kind of jumped the gun with it and didn't make something interesting enough. Now that I've talked about all of the fights individually this tier and kind of how I felt about them, I want to give a bit of a final verdict on the tier as a whole, and also go back and kind of talk about how my opinions have changed on P9 and 10 now that I've had so many re-clears of them. First of all, for P9, in my first video I said I think Carbuncle was better, but I'm not sure. Now I say with full confidence, I had way more fun with Carbuncle on re-clears. I felt like that fight was a lot more interesting and did more innovative things than P9 does. P9 has Limit Cut, but that's kind of all it has. I like the Martialist phases with dodging the cracks on the ground and stuff, but other than that, it's just okay to me, and I don't love it. I feel like it's pretty likely I'll be skipping P9 every week going forward now, because I have everything I need for it on 2 jobs that I play, and I'm not really looking to gear anything else up right now, and the fight's just boring, and I don't really care to do it every week, you know? Do I hate this fight all of a sudden? No, it's fine. It's just like, I feel like most first turns probably get boring after you've done them so many times anyway. Maybe I'll look into gearing up an alt job like Machinist and learning that in here, so I just have something else to think about while I'm doing the fight. P10, on the other hand, has been one of the most entertaining fights on a weekly basis. I absolutely love this fight now, even more than I did when I was first doing it. Because that, like, stress of needing to clear the fight and having it done and, like, joining clear parties and stuff is over now, when I go into re-clear parties, I don't care how, like, scuffed or just terrible it is, because it's something to laugh about and just have a great time. I've seen some of the craziest shit in P10 reclears, and it's always just fucking hilarious. I can't even be mad about it anymore, because I already cleared the fight. There's no, like, doubt in my mind that I can do it again. Like, of course I can. So it just ends up being a much more, like, entertaining experience than a stressful one that it was when I was progging it. This is going to be different for everyone, though, because, like, there's definitely tons of people who only care about getting their reclears done as fast as possible and just being done with it. So to them, P10 is less entertainment as it is just frustration. And I can totally understand that, but for me, I just try to separate myself from the salt in reclears because it's just not worth it, man. Reclearing P11 made me very bored of it. In contrast, like, I'm so bored of that fight. I dread it the most every week, not because it's, like, hard or takes a long time, but just because it's fucking boring. And I only just recently cleared P12 this week, so I haven't had the opportunity to see what reclears are like for that, but I imagine they're going to be an absolute fucking mess. All in all, the Savage tier had its plenty of ups and downs for me. I think Party Finder made it a lot more miserable than it otherwise would have been if I was in a static or something with any degree of consistency, because P12 in specific, I've never seen a more inconsistent pool of players in my life. Every party is just completely different. There's no level of consistency on mechanics. Some guy will do everything right the first pull and then just fuck up para 2 5 times in a row all of a sudden, and you're like, what is happening right now? But yeah, this video has ended up being incredibly long because I just have a lot to say. I have a lot to say about this tier. I spent a lot of fucking time in these Savage fights, so I mean, of course I have a lot to say by now. If you made it this far into the video, thank you. I hope you enjoyed listening to me ramble about these fights and break them down, kind of just give my thoughts on what it was like to do in PF. Remember to subscribe to the Big Blue Purple channel if you're not already. I make near weekly Final Fantasy XIV content. Obviously, there was like 2 weeks between this video and the last one because I spent so much time in P12 parties that I just didn't have time to fucking make anything. Otherwise, please leave a comment about how your Savage experience has been this tier. What's the goofiest party finder you've joined so far that was just a complete disaster? I always love hearing about that shit, so just start a discussion in the comments below. I love reading your guys' comments, and yeah. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I will catch you in the next one.